Did you ever have a job where sometimes you report to one manager, but other times you report to a different one? Like, if you ever had a shift manager, on certain days it's one manager, on other days it's a different manager, or even like a sports team where maybe you were kind of one team from year to year, but one year one person was your coach, and another year another person was your coach. And even though those two managers or those two coaches technically had the same role, right? They had the same authority, yet somehow one of them was a more effective leader. You were somehow more inclined to follow one of them than you were to follow another. For some reason, one of them seemed to have more influence than another. And this question of influence, right? Influence is incredibly valuable. And I think it's something that we all want. Because if we have no influence, basically what that means is no one listens to us, no one cares what we think. And I don't think any of us want to believe that that's true about ourselves. Because with influence, then we can start to be part of changing things. We can start to be part of making our families healthier, making our community a better place. When we have influence, we can start to be either an effective member of something that's going on or even possibly a leader, because we can begin to draw people together, be part of achieving change. In fact, I think doing kind of anything worthwhile requires some degree of influence. So the question is where does influence come from? Now, it turns out that much of our influence does come from the roles that we hold, right? That if you're a parent or if you're a grandparent, there is influence that you get automatically because of the child is your child or your grandchild. As that child grows up, and they might not listen to everything you say, but you have some influence. If you have a managerial position in a job, or you have influence because of your position. A police officer automatically has authority and influence to a point. I mean, honestly, even in a simple case, an umpire in a sporting event or a referee, that position gives them influence. They have authority. But that kind of authority is positional authority, right? Because the thing is that if we look at the idea of the two managers where you tend to follow one more than another, or the two coaches where one just seems to be a better leader than the other, they both have the same position. Therefore, they are both granted the same positional authority. In other words, the authority and influence that automatically comes with the role. But it turns out that positional authority is only one kind of authority. In fact, of the two kinds of authority that there are, positional is actually the less influential kind of authority. Another more powerful kind of authority is moral authority. Right? And moral authority isn't about moralism. Moral authority is about earning something over time. That over time, your actions and behavior cause people to start to trust you. Trust that you're honest, yes, but also trust that you have their best interest in mind. Trust that you have wisdom in certain areas. Right? Those things all come down to moral authority. And kind of the only way we can really build moral authority is to actually deal with people and deal with people well. Moral authority cannot be kind of just given to you. People have to individually grant it to you. People have to see the way you live your life, see the way you handle situations, see that you really have their best interest in mind, or that you are wise in certain areas. And as you do that, people will start to grant you moral authority. In fact, the thing is that moral authority is so significant that people often seek it out in others without even realizing it. That we've all had people in our lives where there's someone who, they're not part of our reporting structure at work, right? We're not even related to them necessarily. But when we have questions in our lives, they're a person we ask, at least in certain areas. Someone you might trust to guide you in your career or guide you with family struggles. And there's nothing about their position that makes that the case. It's simply over time, you've grown to trust them because of the way they've treated you or the way you've seen them treat other people. And moral authority is so important because it's the thing that allows us to achieve positive outcomes in our family, positive outcomes in our work, positive outcomes in our community. And all those things really come down to influence. So today, as we start a new series, the series is Creating Influence. And what I want to look at in this series is the role of moral authority and what it makes possible. And today specifically, I want to talk a bit about how moral authority works. How do we actually achieve moral authority? And the thing that's also important to keep in mind is how easy it is to lose moral authority. And I kind of want to repeat this point. Moral authority is not about moralism. It's not about you've got these magic morals. It's about earning trust, earning the right to be heard, and being in a place where people believe that you have their best interest in mind. So to go through that, I want to look at one of the most famous people from what we call the Old Testament, the ancient Jewish scriptures. And that's the guy named David, the guy who would one day be known as King David. Now, David's life is super interesting because David was born into, for lack of a better word, he was born into an insignificant family. His name had no real recognition. He had not really been granted kind of any special place in society because of the family he was born into. He was the youngest child of an insignificant family. I mean, he was such that his father even seemed to ignore him. But he worked as a shepherd. But this young shepherd would one day grow to be not just the king of his country, but largely considered one of the greatest kings his country ever had. Now, to move from being a lowly shepherd in a small family to one of the greatest kings in your country's history, something must have happened in the middle somewhere, right, to change that. And what we know is that as David kind of steps onto the scene, there's kind of this one event that seemed to really change the trajectory of his life. What is David most commonly associated with? Goliath, David and Goliath. He faced an incredibly difficult challenge and came out the other side. Right? Here's this great warrior who had every reason to cast fear into everyone because people were so afraid of him. He was so effective and such a great warrior. And David was unafraid, or at least he didn't let his fear stop him. He probably was afraid, but he didn't let his fear stop him. And he stepped into it. He stepped into the battle and became the unlikely victor. And once he did that, people noticed him. Most notably, the king at that time noticed him. And when you become the guy who defeats the warrior that everyone else was so afraid of, you start to get special things. So suddenly, David, who was kind of, no one even knew who he was, where he was from, what family he was a part of, suddenly the king says, you can marry my daughter. You'll be my son-in-law. And also, I'm going to make you a leader in my army. And so suddenly, he goes from kind of nowhere to suddenly having these really significant positions that came with tremendous positional authority. Son-in-law of the king came with lots of authority. A leader in the army came with lots of authority. And the thing that happened is that for David, once he got in those positions, he didn't rest on his positional authority. He actually went to work doing the things that were expected, that he became a great warrior and a great leader. But also at the same time, he was a protector of the innocent. And he was honorable in all of his dealings. So what ended up happening is that David recognized that positional authority on its own was not enough, but his position gave him the opportunity to develop greater moral authority. Now that's a really good thing. For David, it's a good thing for everybody except one person, the king. Because the guy who was king at that time starts noticing that when I ride into town, nobody seems to care. David rides into town and people start cheering. And kings don't take that well. So the king decided that David had to go and actually starts trying to kill David, to get rid of him, leaving David no choice but to run. So what that meant was he had to abandon everything that he had gained, right? Any wealth he had gained, as well as the positions that he had gained, that he was basically leaving behind his wife, and he was leaving the army. Which meant that as he left those positions, he lost his positional authority. There was no more authority automatically granted to him because of his position. But as he left, hundreds of people followed him. Why? his moral authority. They looked at him and all the good that he had done and how he had helped so many people and he had fought so valiantly and he had defended them so well. And he was shown to be wise in certain matters. That they felt that even though by following him they would become outlaws, they were better off following him and dealing with whatever came with that than staying behind. So what that meant is that for David, even as he lost all of those positions and all the authority that came with them, people still trusted him and people still followed him. And part of what makes David so remarkable is that even as he's on the run, he continues to grow his moral authority, that he continues to lead his men well. When they're in battle, they continue to fight well. But at the same time, he continued to defend the innocent, to defend the helpless. And so at the narrative we look at today, we kind of step into David's life at this point where he's been on the run. He's got all this moral authority that he's built up. He's done so much good along the way. But we see him in a moment where he almost throws all of it away. He gets frustrated, he gets emotional, and in an instant, a lifetime of moral authority that he's built up, a lifetime of trust, a lifetime of trusted leadership, in one instant, he almost throws it all away. Now, this happens after David and his men have been on the run for a while, but they finally reach this area where they're far enough from where the king is located that they can settle down and they can set up camp. And they actually end up spending an extended period of time in this one place. And where they're at is near the home of a very wealthy man named Nabal. Now, unlike David, Nabal was descended of a great family, one of the most highly regarded families in the country. It most likely inherited much of his wealth, but he was a very wealthy man. And remember that in the ancient world, wealth is not about stacks of gold. In the ancient world, wealth is, I got lots of livestock, I got lots of people working for me. So for Nabal, he had really large herds of sheep. And so David and his men are camped where these shepherds are out with all the sheep. And David knew how hard it was to be a shepherd. Shepherd was a really dangerous job, particularly when you're dealing with flocks that large, because wild animals want to come along and take those sheep. They're easy picking, right? Sheep are easy to kill. Also, there were a lot of traveling bandits, right? Marauders that would come through and who would take the sheep, as well as kill the shepherds. So David had compassion on those shepherds, knowing that Nabal had not really done anything to care for them. He just sent them out to do the job. If you lose a few, you lose a few. So David instructed his men to protect these shepherds. And not just protect the shepherds, but protect the sheep. So over time, these shepherds began to trust David as well. But then as time goes on, the thing about raising sheep is, for most of the time you have the sheep, they cost you money. You got to feed them, you got to take care of them. But there's this one time of the year where things change. When you collect the wool, when you shear the sheep. So after all this time, David's there as it's time to shear the sheep. And so for Nabal, this is big money time. This is celebration time. So what happens is as the sheep come in, the shepherds come in, they start shearing all the wool. Nabal throws a big party because that's what you did. So you had huge amounts of food, huge amounts of wine. And David knows that because of the work of his men, the protection they had provided, Nabal's probably having a better year than he ever has, because he would have expected to lose some of those sheep. Probably some of those shepherds too, but he probably didn't care about that so much. But he'd lose some of the sheep. So David takes the stance that, well, you're having a really good year. We've done what was right by you. Would you please do what is right by us? Since you're having such a good year and we kind of helped you have that, would you just give us some supplies? And although that might sound strange to us, in the ancient world that was normal. That those who had skills would trade their skills for resources from those who had resources. So David's request is really reasonable. So he sends some men to ask Nabal very nicely about that. And so as we step into the narrative, we see that Nabal's not such a nice guy. That Nabal's pretty arrogant. Says, "Who is this fellow David?" Nabal sneered to the young men. "Who does this son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. And right away, we see that Nabal knows who David is. I mean, he knows who David is so well, he knows who his father is. So he knows about David's reputation as a fighter. He knows that David is probably expected to be king one day. And he knows that David is on the run from the current king. And he doesn't care. He makes it a point to insult David. In fact, he goes on and says, "Should I take my bread, my water, my meat that I've slaughtered from my shearers and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where?" So he's a pretty rude, ignorant dude, right? Pretty full of himself, right? My bread, my water, my meat. And my favorite line in that I've slaughtered. Do you really think Nabal walked over and slaughtered those sheep? He instructed his men to do it. He's arrogant, he's boastful, he's disrespectful. What's interesting is that Nabal would have had tremendous positional authority because of his name, because of his wealth. He would have had tremendous positional authority. But if moral authority comes from treating people well, it seems pretty unlikely that he had much of that. So now, as David's men get this news, and they head back to see David, and they tell David what's going on, David is not happy. Right? Because not only has Nabal said no to a very reasonable request, Nabal has also insulted David. Well, what is David most known for? What is the greatest skill that David has? Killing people. He's a tremendous warrior. He is the greatest warrior in his nation. And so as he hears all this, the warrior inside comes out. Basically, David's response, "Get your swords." He strapped on his own. And then 400 men started off with David. 200 remained behind to guard the equipment. David is so upset in this moment, he would later go on to say, "May God strike me and kill me if even one man of Nabal's household is still alive tomorrow morning." Now, does this sound like the David that's built up all this moral authority? But somewhere along the way, he's just tired of it. He's gotten tired, he's gotten emotional, and although he has spent a lifetime building up this moral authority by dealing with difficult situations well, today is not the day. He is not up for it. And in this case, he isn't just yelling at people, he is prepared to go out and kill people. Now remember that the reason David's men followed him was because of the person that he was, right? He had no positional authority. No one made these men follow him. They followed him because of his moral authority, because he was a brave warrior, because he cared for his men, he led well. And he was a protector of the innocent. He was a great leader. These men had left everything behind. These men who were following David had left everything behind because David helped them to be part of something bigger than themselves. Right? They had been on the run as outlaws, but they were doing good along the way, and they got to see this. In fact, things like they were doing with these shepherds at the time were the reason that they followed him. That they weren't just using their skills for brutality. They were doing good things because of that. They followed David because of a lifetime of what he had done to earn his moral authority. Yet in one moment, he's about to throw all that away. He's about to lead these men to go and kill everyone. And you know who the everyone includes? The people they were protecting yesterday. Right? And this would have been an easy slaughter for them. Right? David and his men are warriors. They're trained for battle. These shepherds, these servants, these guys weren't trained for battle. This would have been easy taking. In fact, the reason that David and his men had to protect them is they had no skills in battle. Yet David's instructing his men to flip the tables now and use their skills against these very same men. To act like the marauders that they had been protecting these men against. Now, for David's men, in the moment, they're quite excited. What do? They do battle for a living. They get excited about going into battle. Right? Warriors like battle. But what's going to happen when the battle's done? When the battle's over, And those men turn around and look around at what they had just done and realize that the people they had just completely defeated had no ability to defend themselves. After that happens, how would these men have looked at themselves? And more importantly, how would these men have looked at David? And that's the thing that I want to kind of take an aside about, is that we need to recognize that we build our moral authority over time. We build influence over time. People start to trust us over time, and it takes a long time to build up influence and moral authority. It takes no time to lose it. That at this point, David's probably somewhere between 25 and 30 years old, probably spent the last 10 years or so building up his moral authority. In one afternoon, he was going to throw all that away. And we need to recognize that in our own lives, that we can damage our relationship with our children, with our families, with our coworkers, with our friends, when we allow our emotions to grow to the point that we're allowing ourselves to act well out of character. Now, for David, thankfully, before he actually reaches Nabal's household, someone else steps into the picture. Because one of the shepherds that were there with Nabal, who had also been out with David, see what Nabal says. And keep in mind, these guys would have known how fierce, these shepherds would have known how fierce David's men are. Decide that they're not going to trust their future to Nabal. They go talk to someone else. Now, it's someone kind of unexpected. It's Nabal's wife, Abigail. And they go to Abigail and they tell her what happened. They tell her that David and his men have treated us well, and tell her what Nabal just said. And so the shepherd says to Abigail, David's men have been very good to us, and we never suffered any harm from them. Nothing was stolen from us the whole time they were with us. In fact, day and night, they were like a wall of protection to us and to the sheep. And so his point is that he's taking care of us, and he took care of the livestock. You know, we as a family, or we as a clan, are better off because these guys were here. David's request is completely reasonable. Now, it's great that the shepherd said all that, but why is he saying this to Abigail? Remember, this is the ancient world. The time frame's like 3,000 years ago. In the ancient world, women had very little authority, didn't really have positions of power. I mean, Abigail, as Nabal's wife, would have certainly been shown respect because she is Nabal's wife. But she wasn't in charge of the shepherds or the shearers. Why would these men go talk to her? Because she had something way more valuable than positional authority. She had moral authority that clearly over the years, Abigail had helped them when Nabal let them down. They had seen her wisdom. They had seen her honesty. They had seen that she cared about their well-being. Because when you have moral authority, people look to you, people invite you in to be part of their lives, to walk in life with them without being required to do so. They seek you out because of your influence, because they trust you. And as Abigail is informed of what's going on, we see why Nabal's men trust her so much. We see why she's built up so much moral authority. Right? Because the odds are, the guys weren't really coming to kill her. Right? She could have probably hid somewhere and been fine. But she doesn't do that. As soon as she learns what's going on, she actually steps into what's going on. Is that basically right away she says, okay, he wanted supplies. We're going to give him way more supplies than he asked for. Right? So she tells the men to load up meat, bread, grain, wine, load it all up, load up the donkeys. And she doesn't tell the men to take the supplies to David. She says, I'll take the supplies to David. And so she rides out to meet David along with the supplies. Now remember that who David is known through this region. So she would have known that he is very capable in battle. She would have known that one day he's expected to be king. She would have known that he's been on the run for years. So she knew that she was stepping into an incredibly dangerous situation. And as she approaches David, that fear is confirmed because she sees David dressed for battle, followed by 400 other men dressed for battle. And just as she approaches, she hears when he says, "May God strike me and kill me if even one man of Nabal's household is still alive tomorrow morning." But then we see why Nabal's men trust her so much. Because as she hears that, she fell at David's feet and said, "I accept all blame in this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say." So she basically throws herself in front of David. Basically says, if you're going to keep going, you're going to have to step on me. Unfortunately, he didn't step on her. But what she's doing, right, is that she is redirecting David. Right? She's showing him respect. And then she wants to be very clear that she realizes that what Nabal did is wrong. She says, "I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. Please don't pay any attention to him. He's a fool, just as his name suggests." Now, that last phrase is kind of funny, but the word Nabal sounds like the Hebrew word for fool or stupidity. Particularly the word's used when someone's very arrogant. So she's saying, the name, he got the right name. So we're all used to him acting that way. But then she goes on, "But I never even saw the young men you sent." In other words, I wasn't there when you made this request, your incredibly reasonable request. So Nabal's an idiot. Forget about him, right? I'm here now. Let's you and I talk, and let's get this sorted out. So the first thing she does is she says, "Hey, that request you made is really good. Here's those supplies you asked for." And again, she's providing way more than he would have expected. And also, we see why she's so brilliant, because in addition to pointing out the supplies, she knows that, yes, David is angry because he asked for supplies and didn't get them. But she knows there's something else he is way more angry about. And if you're a guy, you get this. He's been disrespected. Right? Do anything but disrespect me. And David has been on the run for years because the king is disrespecting him. And today, Nabal disrespected him. And today is the day David cannot take any more disrespect. And that is the key thing that led him to lose his cool. I mean, he would have still been unhappy if he didn't get the food. I'm not saying he wouldn't have done something, but I'm quite certain it was the disrespect that pushed him over the top. And so Abigail sees that David is at his breaking point. So she's covered off on the easy things, right? She's gotten the food here. She's paid him respect. But she knows that more is needed, that he is so angry and so wound up that those two things are not going to settle him down. But thankfully, she's armed with something still more valuable, which is her moral authority. And because she has it, she recognizes it in David. She knows that David's men follow him not because they have to, but because they trust him, because he has moral authority, because he's a leader, because he has proven who he is. And she knows how hard it is to achieve that, because she's had to work so hard to achieve hers. But she also knows how easy it is to lose. So knowing that, she was able to speak to David in a way that he could finally hear, that he could finally understand. And what she does is she appeals to David's role in his future self. In other words, the role of his moral authority in his future self the day he becomes king. She says, "When the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance." She's basically saying, I know you're upset. You've got every right to be upset. But if you do this, if you do what you want to do right now, in this single instance, all that you have earned in terms of moral authority, in terms of influence, will be gone. If you yield to your emotions, if you yield to your anger, all that will be thrown away. You've spent your lifetime reaching this point. But what you do is going to affect your ability to be king. Because David had seen that just being a king doesn't make you a good king. The king that he's running from right now is not a good king. Right? That king has positional authority, But that king had no moral authority. David, as an effective leader, understood that great leaders don't lean on their positional authority to get things done. They build their moral authority. And then from that strength of position and moral authority, that's how they become great leaders. That's how they serve as great leaders. So what Abigail basically said to him was, the decision you make in the next 5 minutes will determine your future. It will determine whether you are a great leader. It will determine whether you are a great king. And we all face those moments in our lives, right? We all have moral authority. We all have influence over more people than we think we do. But when we give into our emotions, particularly anger or frustration, we risk throwing that away. It takes so much longer to build it than it does to lose it. Now, thankfully, as David heard what Abigail said, he stood down and he called off the attack. And so David actually preserved his moral authority. But let's think about Abigail. For the men who were there and saw what Abigail did, she built her moral authority. Right? She put the needs of someone else ahead of her own. She stepped into a difficult situation and used her ability to actually save the situation, turn it around. And the fact that David would later become a great king is partly because of Abigail, because she saved him from this moment. But more immediately, all the men in Nabal's clan were saved because of what she did. And so, my friends, as we wrap up, the thing that I want to really encourage us all with is that we all have the ability to be a powerfully positive influence in our family, in our friends, in our community, throughout our nation. We have that ability. But to do that, we require moral authority. And over time, we can add to that moral authority. Over time, as we interact with people well, treat people well, use wisdom, we add to our moral authority. But literally, in an instant, we can lose it. And it all comes down to how we treat people. Right? We add to our moral authority, we add to our influence when we invest in people. When, like David and Abigail, stand up for others. Right? That we actually use our power and position to help other people who do not hold the same power and position. We grow our moral authority when we work to improve lives, when we actually look around at people who are marginalized or pushed down or pushed back, and we step in to do what we can to improve their situation. When people are hurting and need resources that they don't have, when we invest in those and step into those, we build our influence. But at the same time, we also build our influence when we simply know someone who's having a difficult decision, but our experiences enable us to have another perspective that might be helpful. Basically, it's when we are willing to be part of improving someone's situation when we receive no benefit from it. Those are the things that build our moral authority, that build our influence. But we've also got to recognize we lose our moral authority, we lose our influence when we fail to invest in people. Now, that can happen when we are like David here, lose our temper and just kind of go nuts and kind of say things or do things that are hard to come back from. But it's also important to note that we do not have to be the perpetrator of wrongdoing to lose our moral influence. We can also lose it by just standing by and watching things happen, and watching evil happen, and watch people be marginalized, and watch people have things taken from them. When we stand by and watch that erodes our moral authority, that erodes our influence almost as much as being the perpetrator itself. When we accept that, we lose our opportunity to be a positive influence on the people around us. So my friends, as we kind of think through kind of what we've seen in David's life and what Abigail did, and this important point and place that influence and moral authority play in our lives, as we look at the people we interact with, as we look at the things that happen around our world, around our country, and around our region, when we accept wrongdoing, we are giving up our influence. But when we are willing to step into things and be part of the solution, not accepting that things are just hard, so we're not going to try, but saying that we're going to make a difference, that we're going to be there for those who need it, and do it with no expectation of something in return. That is exactly what Jesus calls us to do, to step in and be part of improving the lives of people around us, to use the things we're given to make a difference.